Modernity. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to make a few brief but very important notes. So I'd first like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize the original and current caretakers of this land that UCR is currently on, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceño, and Serrano peoples, including all of their ancestors and descendants in the past, present, and future. As UCR students, faculty, and staff, it is our responsibility to not only acknowledge the land we are currently on, but continuously transgress our land acknowledgements beyond performative activism and into more meaningful activism. I would also like to thank the Global 19th Century Workshop organizers, including Catherine Henshaw, Dr. Heidi Breivik-Zender, Dr. Susan Zeiger, and Dr. Jonathan Ecott for organizing this virtual event. Thank you. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. Okay, my video on. Can everyone see me and the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the, the vocal confirmation. All right, so this is Muscular Christianity in Latin America, Attempted Liberations Through the Myth of Modernity. A very tender and very gringo hug reads on the front page of El Diablito Bromista. Right above this caption, a cartoon illustrates a gluttonous Uncle Sam forcibly hugging Señora Mexican Republic as he makes intense eye contact with an aggravated and ready to brawl vaquero. The Mexican penny newspaper, El Diablito Bromista, commonly used satire as a way to illuminate agrarian working class critiques on political corruptions during the Mexican Revolution. Indeed, a very tender hug from Uncle Sam was also a particularly gringo one, as he sits on top of and next to states shaped like money bags that were previously considered the land of Mexico, but became parts of the US through this destructive Western imperialism. As a pueblo burns in the background, the vaquero tightens his fists, preparing himself to brawl with Uncle Sam, as he will not let Uncle Sam take his woman, Señora Mexican Republic, sitting down. It may be initially tempting to accept the satirical critique of US imperialism as a general political perspective of the Mexican people versus the elite and their violently intimate and inextricable connections with the US and Mexican republics. Yet, accepting this overgeneralized binary not only minimizes the distinct makeup of agrarian social modes of relations, as well as the distinct cultivation of masculinity related to Mexican revolutionary leaders like Francisco Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, but ignores the diverse political perspectives of other Mexican people and communities during the Mexican Revolution. For instance, the diverse perspectives of Mexican women are hardly represented by the satirical cartoon, as women are not the central focus in general. A single well-dressed woman is objectified into the abstraction of the Mexican Republic, while the Mexican Republic itself becomes tangible through her female form within a hyper-masculine space. Another perspective is that of Mexican muscular Christians who welcomed interventions from the US state in general and white American Protestant men in particular. For Mexican muscular Christians, these interventions were not only part of a seemingly collaborative efforts that would end the carnage from the Mexican Revolution, but parts of collaborative efforts toward forming modern liberal democracies worldwide. These men and their particular political perspectives are one of the main focuses for this project. In his brilliant work, War Against All Puerto Ricans, Nelson A. Dennis sheds light on the relatively unknown history of the 1950 Puerto Rican Revolution. But in his first few chapters that examine the state of Puerto Rico immediately after the Spanish-American War in 1898, Nelson frames US imperialism as an overtly oppressive force toward the Puerto Rican American people, overgeneralizing a binary between the US state versus the Puerto Rican people. In other words, Nelson suggests that soon after the Spanish-American War, the war against all Puerto Ricans was a blatant war, minimizing the insidious aspect of imperialism, in which imperialism was often masked as foreign aid. Nelson's suggestion of an overt war also minimizes the political perspectives of Puerto Ricans that welcome such, quote, foreign aid, unquote, such as Puerto Rican muscular Christians who eagerly embraced it in order to dismantle the corrupt force that was the Catholic Church. Muscular Christianity from 1880 through 1920 was not an organized religion, but rather a social movement that emphasized virtuous masculinity. Virtuous masculinity here refers to social constructions of Christian masculinity that emphasize certain masculine virtues to ultimately promote high moral standards. Originating in the global West, muscular Christians in the US advocated for, quote, a Christian commitment to health and manliness, unquote, as historian Clifford Putney succinctly puts it, and, quote, rigorous physical training for the goodness of men's souls, unquote, as religious studies scholar Annie Blazer states. Motivations to build muscular Christian organizations, such as the Young Men's Christian Associations, YMCAs, in the US, initially came from white American muscular Christians wanting to develop Christian alternatives to places like local city taverns. In Latin America, muscular Christians endorsed an active and clean lifestyle within urban spaces that upheld the Christian moral code of conduct regarding integrity and hygiene. In other words, la limpieza es junto a la piedad. Cleanliness is next to godliness. When referring to Latin America, I will be examining muscular Christianity and its particular manifestations in Mexico and Puerto Rico. My fluctuating reference of muscular Christianity as a single global movement involving virtuous masculinity and muscular Christianity in a plural sense with various manifestations is intentional, as this fluctuation gets to the heart of this project. I started this project with a clear intention to emphasize the distinct ways in which Puerto Rico and Mexican muscular Christians adopted muscular Christianity in order to avoid overgeneralizing social movements in Latin America, but the similar efforts of Puerto Rican and Mexican muscular Christians to foster a sense of universality and camaraderie among muscular Christians around the world, especially with American muscular Christians, cannot be ignored. Thus, the main research question isn't whether or not an authentic and genuine universal muscular Christianity existed, but rather how Latin American muscular Christians utilized a universal framing of muscular Christianity as a way to not only navigate, but attempt to dismantle destructive forces related to their socioeconomic conditions. To inform my research, I mainly examine primary sources of various mediums, including articles and illustrations from Latin American periodicals, Mexican photographs available at the Mediateca del Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, and the official court case decisions of the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico. Evangelical periodicals, such as El Puerto Rico Evangelico and El Faro, as well as photographs of the YMCA in Mexico City, not only demonstrate particular adoptions of muscular Christianity, but how Latin American muscular Christians utilized a universal framing of muscular Christianity in order to try and dismantle the destructive forces relative to their socioeconomic conditions. The court case decisions of the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico provide additional context of the Catholic Church and US imperialism as hegemonic forces in Puerto Rico. Due to the very limited amount of research on muscular Christianity in Latin America, this project is highly archivally driven. Thus, I argue that in their efforts toward liberation from destructive forces relative to their socioeconomic conditions, Latin American muscular Christians utilized a universal framing of muscular Christianity, not only as a tool, but as one vital aspect of modernity, an all-encompassing epistemology that, quote, stressed the sovereignty of the people, the sanctity of private property, free speech, and representative government, unquote. Yet in their efforts toward liberations from destructive forces and toward modern liberal democracies, Latin American muscular Christians unintentionally complied to a larger hegemonic force that was US imperialism. The conceptualization of modernity comes from Pamela Voykel's work, Alone Before God, The Religious Origins of Modernity in Mexico, in which the historian argues that the origins of modernity in Mexico were religious and mobilized by elite liberals. But in terms of this project, modernity was not exclusively ascribed by elite liberals, but embraced by the petite bourgeoisie, including Latin American muscular Christians who promoted urban social modes of relations as well as urban material culture in order to ultimately advance modern liberal democracies for all people. In her conceptualization of modernity, Voykel lists a fifth criteria of modernity, the exclusion of the unvirtuous from enfranchisement, which may first seem like it's applicable to muscular Christianity in Latin America, since the social movement is in part emphasized virtuous in virtuous masculinity. But in their visions of global modernity, Latin American muscular Christians did not intend to focus on the exclusion of any persons, rather including everyone in their collaborative partnership with the US in the unfolding of liberal democracies around the world. Immediately after her conceptualization of modernity, Voikel refers to Americanist historian Florencia Malone on how the seeming universality of modernity actually delegitimizes and excludes not only other ideas of state formation from other communities, but excludes such communities themselves. So this goes back to my point on the invisibility of diverse political perspectives, such as that of Mexican women. Yet the seemingness of universality in modernity was not the only aspect of modernity that was seeming. Rather, as Argentinian-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel argues in his work, The Invention of the Americas, every aspect of modernity and modernity itself was and continues to be seeming, in which the naturally superior and Eurocentric ontology is merely an appearance, a myth that constantly engages with people in the periphery for world domination. In his work, Dussel points out that people in the periphery can ascribe to the myth of modernity, such as people in the periphery describing the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs as indigenous experience of the end of the world, rather than taking into serious consideration the mobilized efforts of the indigenous to defend themselves, their land, and their people. In regards to the history of Latin American muscular Christianity, muscular Christians attempted liberations from destructive forces through the myth of modernity, only to unintentionally consent to US imperialism as the larger hegemonic force. To begin our deeper exploration of muscular Christianity in Latin America, I want to start with Puerto Rico and establish the Catholic Church as the recognized hegemonic force by Puerto Rican muscular Christians. On September 25th, 1916, the article, quote, "At the Foot of the Abyss," unquote, headlined the front page of the newsletter El Puerto Rico Evangelico. The author, JRC, begins his article by stating a common Puerto Rican saying, "Cuando veas las barbas de tu vecino afeitadas, pon las tuyas en remojo." When you see your neighbor's beard shaved off, wash your own beard. At first glance, this may seem like a saying relating to Latin American muscular Christianity. After all, earlier I stated that virtuous masculinity in Latin America essentially placed cleanliness next to godliness. And on top of that, the image I have displayed on this slide shows Puerto Rican muscular Christians with clean shaven faces. But for Puerto Rican evangelicals like JRC, this common saying was not about centralizing literal facial hair and what it meant in relation to Christian masculinity. Rather, it was about alluding to the Puerto Rican people's blind acceptance of state and cultural mandates brought on by the Catholic Church through the Puerto Rican government. According to JRC, the church was trying to bring religion to schools. Meanwhile, the church was not allowed to be influenced by anyone or anything. Quote, "But the papal church, faithful to its traditions, does not want anyone to be allowed to live who is not tributary to it and subject to its influences," unquote. As the title of his article suggests, JRC reconfigures the common saying about the beard as standing, quote, "at the foot of the abyss," unquote, in order to help other Puerto Ricans realize that the danger in the hegemonic power of the Catholic Church lied not within the mandates themselves, but in the blind compliance to them. Within the same article, JRC proposes a complete separation of the Catholic Church and state, since according to JRC, religion got in the way of progress. But JRC does not call for a total separation of church and state. According to JRC, complete agnosticism or atheism were not viable options since Latin Americans naturally possessed a zealous disposition. For Puerto Rican evangelicals like JRC, the ideal version of a modern state and society involved a close connection between the Protestant church and the state. In a later issue of El Puerto Rico Evangelico, Manuel Andújar explains, quote, "The common theme was that the Christian religion has produced its legitimate and inevitable fruit by awakening the people to understand their human rights. The only hope is in Protestantism, with the plain truth of the gospel and true freedom," unquote. For Puerto Rican evangelicals like JRC and Manuel Andújar, within a Protestant church and state, the Puerto Rican people would not merely observe their neighbors' beards shaven off and blindly prepare their own allegorical beards for a shaving. Rather, they would fully understand their human rights and could choose whether or not to keep their beards, have a little shaved off, or completely shave it off just like their neighbors. Within the same issue containing Manuel Andújar's article, the front page article, quote, "for our periodical," unquote, written by an unnamed Puerto Rican muscular Christian, integrated muscular Christian frameworks in the shared vision of a modern Protestant church and state. Quote, "In him, the evangelical worker has his constant collaborator, the family, his wise counselor in the country, his selfless and courageous defender," unquote. A little later on, he states, quote, "People preferably read the best presented and most entertaining newspaper. It would be counterproductive to a superlative degree for the representative of united Protestantism to appear badly dressed on the outside and monotonous on the inside, to rub elbows with colleagues who would be ashamed to have him as a partner, unquote. In the first quote, the unnamed muscular Christian framed the Puerto Rican evangelical man not only as a worker, but almost as if he was a war general with his family as a wise counselor and his country as his selfless, courageous defender. Warlike framings and discourses were very common in muscular Christianity, such as in Theodore Roosevelt's political speeches and writings. But what's unique about Latin American muscular Christianity was its constant engagement with things and people considered overtly feminine by white American muscular Christians. Muscular Christians in the US did not emphasize engaging with family for counsel, rather having men lead their families at all times. In terms of the second quote, the unnamed Puerto Rican muscular Christian framed the newsletter El Puerto Rico Evangelico as a businessman that represented a united Protestantism. As a businessman, it was important for the newsletter to make a great first impression on his colleagues, the Puerto Rican people, by dressing well and being interesting. Failure of a great first impression would not only cause shame, as the author blatantly points out, but would cease communication between the newsletter and the Puerto Rican people. How could there be a development of a Protestant church and state if people never read articles like At the Foot of the Abyss in order to fully understand the Catholic Church as the hegemonic power and learn about the proposed modern Protestant church and state? Before I move on to my next point, I'd like to point out that the well-dressed businessman archetype was very important in Latin American muscular Christianity. Later on, we will observe photographs of well-dressed Mexican muscular Christians in the YMCA. And the idea of the businessman being interesting connects to the efforts of white American muscular Christians who initially created YMCAs to provide Christian and fun alternatives to places like taverns in US cities. Now, I'd like to move on by exploring the Puerto Rican muscular Christians' perspectives on trying to attain the modern Protestant church and state through a seemingly shared and collaborative effort with white American muscular Christians and important US state officials. The most immediate and evident example of this is the front cover of the October 1916 issue of El Puerto Rico Evangelico, which features a photograph of the Bible Institute in Los Angeles. As you may recall, the satirical cartoon I showed at the beginning of this presentation, many Mexican agrarian working class folks were painstakingly aware that California was part of Mexico before Western imperialism. Whereas within this issue of El Puerto Rico Evangelico, American building and expansion in California was celebrated. Another example of a seemingly shared collaborative effort involves the YMCA column in El Puerto Rico Evangelico, in which updates on YMCAs around the world were listed in this section, and mainly covered updates on YMCAs in the US and in Puerto Rico. Within the same issue featuring the photograph of the Bible Institute in Los Angeles, an update on raising funds for the YMCA building in the capital of Puerto Rico, San Juan, was published. According to the column, the fundraising campaign concluded with $10,103.70, with 247 people having contributed. The president of the Fajardo Sugar Company, Sir James B. Combs, and his associates matched the raised funds in Puerto Rico. The update ends with, quote, "The association now is without worry, with a magnificent building and with the best facilities in order to help the youth of this island develop physically, intellectually, and spiritually. Now that this weight has been lifted, we can wait for the association to progress much more, and that its job is always effective," unquote. But was the weight really lifted? Or more accurately, was the weight only lifted momentarily? Did the seemingness of collaboration to dismantle the Catholic Church and realize a vision of a modern Protestant church and state actually help drop the heavier weight that was US imperialism with a faster velocity? Although I don't agree with Nelson in his work, War Against All Puerto Ricans, that the war was a blatant war to all Puerto Ricans immediately after the Spanish-American War, I do very much agree that US imperialism was pervasive in nearly every aspect of Puerto Rico. I've been using this photograph a lot during this presentation, and I really like to spend some time observing it and thinking about it in terms of imperialism as this insidious force of power that was not blatantly oppressive, but nevertheless still existed as a powerful and violent form of oppression. This photograph may initially seem like a standard team photograph, but take a closer look at the body language of the men in this photo. The men on the ground seem pretty relaxed with some arms flexing, the men on the ground seem pretty relaxed with some arms flexing as some of them put their weight on it. The black man standing with a white suit stands with an upright posture and his hands behind his back. The white man in the middle also stands with an upright posture, but in a power pose. His hands are on his sides as he confidently stands in the middle. I argue that this photograph exemplifies imperialism as that insidious but nevertheless oppressive systematic force. Another example of U.S. imperialism is that another example of U.S. imperialism as that larger, insidious, hegemonic force lies within the formal decision of the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico in the case of the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church of Puerto Rico versus the people of Puerto Rico in 1909. As a very short summary of this court case, the Supreme Court justices that came from the US federal government had to decide whether or not to restore properties to the church that were legally promised by the Spanish back in 1838, or to allow the public institutions that were built on the properties before the Spanish-American War to continue existing for and by the Puerto Rican people. A majority of the court decided to reinstate the properties back to the Catholic Church, not only fueling the particular tension between the church and Puerto Rican evangelicals, but permitting the Catholic Church to exercise control over the people and public institutions like schools, which is exactly what some of the articles in the Puerto Rico Evangelical tried to illuminate a few years later. I'd also like to quickly note how the leading justices of the ruling and dissent in this case sometimes lacked seriousness and professionalism in their statements. For instance, words such as interesting were often used to describe the case. To continue our deeper exploration of muscular Christianity in Latin America, we will continue with Mexico and establish the overall violence and carnage from the Mexican Revolution as the recognized destructive force by Mexican muscular Christians. Although an origin of Mexican muscular Christianity began with the liberal elite, as shown in the photograph on the left-hand side, in which the European-minded President Porfirio Diaz inaugurated the first YMCA in Mexico. So he's standing in there in the middle, kind of looking towards the crowd. The Mexican petite bourgeoisie became involved with the movement during the Mexican Revolution. So this is shown on the photograph on the right-hand side, including members of the YMCA in Mexico City. There's a lot of members coming out of the building. The petite bourgeoisie, or Mexican muscular Christians, not only possessed an affinity for urban social modes of relations and material culture, but perceived such social modes of relation and material culture as foundational pillars for constructing representations of an ideal post-revolutionary modern society. Notice in the photograph on the right-hand side that there are bullet holes on one of the pillars of the YMCA. Like the photographs we saw before, and the photographs that we will soon observe, this detail highlights their struggle to achieve stable representations of post-revolutionary modern society. So I'll go back to the previous slide for just a little bit. So it's kind of showing this contrast between attempting to create this sort of ideal, this example of an ideal post-revolutionary modern society here, and the brutal realities of the Mexican Revolution. Again, the photograph on the right-hand side depicting, or not on the right-hand side, excuse me, on the left-hand side, depicting a room inside the YMCA building exemplifies the post-revolutionary modern society, and the photograph on the right-hand side depicts soldiers aiming their guns outside while inside the YMCA building, highlighting the brutal realities of the revolution. The soldiers were most likely supporters of Felix Diaz, who was the nephew of President Porfirio Diaz, and were most likely fighting against Maderistas, supporters of the democratically elected President Francisco I Madero. The caption of at the bottom of this image reads, "The 10 tragic days, 9.18 February 1913, soldiers Felicistas in the building of the Young Men's Christian Association." So the 10 tragic days refers to the armed conflict between Maderistas and various factions, including the Felicistas. And I want to highlight that I don't frame Mexican muscular Christianity in relation to a hegemonic force like Puerto Rican muscular Christianity in the Catholic Church. Rather, I frame Mexican muscular Christianity in relation to the Mexican Revolution as a destructive force, because Mexican muscular Christians did not fully align themselves with the political view of agrarian working class revolutionaries, and that illuminated the Mexican bourgeoisie as the hegemonic force. So this goes back again to the first satirical cartoon we saw at the beginning of the presentation. One can argue that Mexican muscular Christians openly supported the hegemonic corruptions of the Mexican elite because of their affinity towards bourgeoisie culture and lifestyles. But that overlooks their efforts to realize their vision of modernity for everyone in Mexico and around the world. For instance, The Mexican evangelical newsletter El Faro published the article, quote, "The Fruit of Christianity," unquote, in which tells a story of a Turkish Muslim man who was unimpressed with the human-made feats in New York City, yet enjoyed the freedom of being able to pray, and then lastly, finally converts to Christianity after receiving medical treatment from an American Presbyterian doctor who treated him equally to a rich or Presbyterian patient. So the doctor claimed he did not see religion or class before treating a patient. Blindness to class, religion, and pretty much blindness to any other social construct was a hallmark of modernity that was shared by both Mexican and American muscular Christians in order to promote a supposed equal and inclusive world. In terms of the US, white muscular Christians like leading YMCA member Howard B. Gross advocated for separate YMCAs between white Americans and African Americans, all while preaching for equality that did not recognize the color of one's skin. In terms of Mexico, muscular Christians describe the women of the Presbyterian organization, Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor, with typically masculine and muscular Christian traits such as discipline and fiery souls, which seems to transgress social constructs and prejudices. Yet in their continuous coverage of African Americans' efforts in raising funds for a YMCA building, Mexican muscular Christians mainly focus their coverage on a wealthy white man, Sir Rosenwald, who matched their funds. Help for the Blacks was the title for this reoccurring newsletter column. The problematic violence and oppression that comes from social construct blindness goes back to Voikel's and Molan's point about universality as a danger of modernity. Trying not to see race, class, and gender to promote equality for all actually ignores other communities' ideas about state and society formation and perpetuates oppression. I want to quickly highlight the two photographs on this slide and how they symbolize the seemingly all-encompassing progress of human beings that comes from modernity. The two photographs depict the YMCA gymnastics team in Mexico City. The picture on the left was taken in 1910, the year that the Mexican Revolution officially began. And the picture on the right was taken in 1923, about 3 years after the Mexican Revolution. Notice how in the earlier photograph, the photo is taken in a somewhat messy recreational space outside the YMCA, and how the gymnastic members are not as symmetrical as the ones in the photograph who are wearing, the ones in the other photograph who are wearing nicer uniforms inside an elegant recreational space. The improvement of the space, uniforms, and the symmetrical form of their own gymnastics routine symbolizes that myth of modernity as this progress for human beings that could somehow transcend social construct into this post-racial, post-gender, post-classist world with liberal democracies thriving from diverse perspectives. So the diverse perspectives, this is when where the different positions of the YMCA members comes in to represent those diverse perspectives of a modern liberal democracy. The last point I would like to make is that the seemingly shared collaboration between Mexican muscular Christians and white American muscular Christians was truly one-sided and unintentionally complied to US imperialism as the larger destructive force that was also hegemonic. In leading American muscular Christian John R. Mott's article, The Greatest Conflict Before the Young Men's Christian Associations, the American muscular Christian missionary explains, quote, "There is a war to which we summon you, the muscular Christian missionaries, tonight. It is among the Turkish Empire, Persia, Arabia, and Egypt. It is in the great continent of Africa. It is in the great continent of India. It is in the islands of the Pacifics. It is in the Sunrise Kingdom of Japan." And then I see another battlefield that we sometimes are prone to overlook. The 10 million of young men of Mexico, Central America, and the South American republics. A warfare against immorality and gambling, against formalism and infidelity, unquote. The same frameworks that Latin American muscular Christians use to try to promote modern liberal democracies and societies were used by US imperialists like John R. Mott on the Latin American people, such as the supposed universality of Latin American men as immoral, gamblers, lacking inner significance, and as unfaithful. In regards to muscular Christianity, Mott framed American muscular Christian missionary work as war, similarly to how warlike discourse was used in Puerto Rico muscular Christianity. Yet Mott's framing positioned the war against Latin American men's lifestyles, including the very men that used the same frameworks as Mott and perceived a mutual collaboration. Latin American muscular Christians attempted liberations through the myth of modernity, unintentionally complying to US imperialism as the larger hegemonic force. So just with some quick closing remarks, some conclusions, I'd just like to talk a little bit about where I would like to keep heading with this research. So in terms of Mexico and Puerto Rico, a lot of the sources that I'm drawing from for Mexican muscular Christianity is very visual, and I'd like to obtain and get access and look through some more newsletters, which is what I have for Puerto Rican muscular Christianity, which is a lot of newsletters from El Puerto Rico evangelical. And for the Puerto Rican muscular Christianity, I like to get more of the visuals, like with Mexican muscular Christianity. So kind of like a crossover to expand there. I'd also like to expand to other regions in Latin America. So I intend to include some analysis on Cuba, especially after the Spanish-American War. And lastly, I've actually been thinking about the huge gap in my research that I actually identify with personally is that of Latin Americans in the US, and comparing and contrasting sort of this Latin American muscular Christianity for Latin Americans that were in the US during this time period compared to those who were still in the Latin American region. So those are just some ways that I'm thinking about expanding this, and I really look forward to the Q&A and the comments after this, and hearing all your own thoughts on this research. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to my discussion, to my talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim, and please welcome me. And yes, I see little applause here. If we were all together in person, there would be loud applause. I'm positive of that. Thank you so much, Kim, for that incredibly rich discussion of your research thus far and your thoughts about where you'd like to take it in the future. I'm sure there's going to be many, many questions, and people should be invited to just, if you'd like to just voice your question and ask it directly, please raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye on who goes first. Or you're very welcome to also write into the chat. I should mention that the talk is being recorded, and it will be posted on the CIS website. And then when it's posted, you'll get an email that it's posted. So it does take a few days, but it will be up online shortly. So if anyone would like to ask a question in the chat, you're most welcome to, or raise your hand if you would like to. Oh, Susan, sorry, I see your hand.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks, Kim, so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. There's so much to think about. I guess I'm kind of curious to, maybe get more of the wider context. Going back to your very first image where you were showing the Mexican Republic figured as, the female figure who's being like horribly embraced by imperialist Uncle Sam. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about in the U. I'm obviously familiar with the U.S. and not with Mexican and Puerto Rican context, but the Christian activism was sort of divided by sex here. So there was a YWCA, and women were permitted and encouraged at the end of the 19th century to take part in these kinds of civic Christian, temperance and, social activism that accorded to those, kinds of dictates. So is there women's activist Christianity is not going to be muscular per se, anywhere in this period, it seems like, but were there complementary women's organizations in Puerto Rico and in Mexico, and what were their relationships with the masculine dominated muscular Christians? And let me know if I've misframed even the question itself, as I sort of, grope to try to say that the way it makes sense.
No, that's definitely a really great question. And I think in one of the slides I have too, referring to the Mexican muscular Christians in the YMCA, like this like photo of all the leaders there. There's also actually some women there too standing. There's a few. And I think for now, I need to do a lot more research on that. But there is definitely not so much activism with women involved in muscular Christianity in Mexico, but sort of reserved spaces for them to exercise their own kind of muscular Christianity. So certain sports women were allowed to participate in, and then it was really not just about gender, but also in terms of class. The women that were more involved were part of the liberal elite rather than in the petite bourgeoisie kind of framing that I have. That's when women really do get involved with like sports that are like horseback riding was a really popular one in Mexico. And then also the type of teaching that they did at the YMCA was reserved specifically for older women that didn't have to do with like physical exercise, but rather more like spiritual or intellectual type of teaching. And I'm trying to see the comparisons of muscular Christianity in the US with that too, but I don't think it's so much about activism, but rather about where are the reserved spaces for women to be a part of this social movement kind of thing. And it wasn't really used, like I said, I'd have to do more research, but I don't think it was really used for social activism, especially because the women that were involved with muscular Christianity tended to be in the more upper class, for sure.
Thank you, Kim. Are there other questions? People are sometimes thinking of questions and how to frame them, so we invite you to keep doing that. And as we're waiting, I actually can jump in with a question of my own. It has to do with the body. You know, you've shown us so many incredible sort of photographs and also, you know, drawings of muscular Christian bodies. And I was kind of struck by how sort of early on in the presentation, you showed a photograph and also a poster art that actually showed nude bodies. And then throughout the presentation, you showed us sort of differently clothed bodies, right? With the petite bourgeoisie, as you were showing, in sort of maybe public spaces. And then the different kinds of the uniforms that the gymnasts were wearing, and then those sort of juxtaposed with the nudes that you showed at the beginning. I just wondered if you've thought about any sort of the differences or similarities between the way that sort of muscular Christianity is being shown in these different types of images of the body, and specifically, you know, the idea of muscles, because in the nudes, you're seeing sort of just a lot more muscles, whereas they're all sort of present also in the gymnast images, but then sort of covered when, you know, the men are wearing the suits. So anyway, I'm just thinking about the body and how it's projected and the ways in which you may be reading this in relation to the question of, you know, hegemony and counter hegemonies. Anyway, I hope that's a coherent enough question.
Yeah, definitely. With that one slide I created that has the poster of the nude white man, and then the image of the nude Mexican muscular Christian taking a shower. I should have probably put this in my presentation, but my earlier project actually focuses on white American muscular Christians and their framing of muscular Christianity. That virtuous masculinity doesn't really have to do with this idea so much of like hygiene and cleanliness, but rather getting back to this idea of like going back to an innate, rugged, nature bounded man. And with Latin American muscular Christianity, it had to do a lot more with hygienics and hygiene and a clean muscular body. And they're definitely different there, but I think they're trying to get to this idea of a society, a perfect, ideal, modern society in different ways, and through those high moral standards and in different ways of posing and building the body. One thing I should note about that I will make clear is that the Latin American muscular Christianity in Mexico, when it started, it was defining itself by what it was not. So I had shown the pictures of Zapata and Pancho Villa, who were Mexican revolutionary leaders and definitely a part of that agrarian form of masculinity, cultivations of masculinity rather than constructions, right? And when muscular Christianity started in Mexico, it started as sort of this is what we are not, which is this like that rugged man, like that's part of working the fields or in pueblos with their family. No, we're part of this more urban construction, clean kind of man. And there's a lot there that would need a lot more unpacking. But yeah, that was a great question about the body, and I hope that answers some of it.
Yeah, thank you. I see a question from Anya.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim, for this exciting talk. So I have just a very basic question. Could you talk a little bit more about the specific time frame that you're focusing on in your research on Latin American muscular Christianity? You know, how far back into the 19th century, and then how far into the 20th century do you hope to go? And then if you can just talk a little bit about the rationale behind choosing this, you know, this specific period. Maybe you already mentioned it and I just missed it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So the timeline is more toward the long 19th century. That means up to like the 1920s or the 1930s. That's how I was able to become a fellow for the Global 19th Century Workshop. But it's most with muscular Christianity in the U.S. It has a lot to do with the late 19th century in terms of like the 1870s. But with Latin American muscular Christianity, I'm really focusing it on the late 1890s, so post Spanish American War, or like right before the Spanish American War, and then up to sort of the beginnings of World War I, and a little bit after, like 1925, post Mexican Revolution, to really focus on the difference of Mexican muscular Christianity. So the photo that I had of the two gymnastics team, one of them was 1923. So I'm really curious to see how muscular Christianity was forming after the official end of the Mexican Revolution in 1920. The second question was about the rationale of this project. So this has a lot to do with like my own research identity. So when I first started doing research on muscular Christianity, I was really intentional about not going into Latin American studies, because I myself was lost in my own research identity about who I am. You know, I was born in Mexico. I grew up in the United States, though I still don't know what it means to be Mexican American. But I stayed really in the framework of the United States. I'm just going to really critically examine these white American muscular Christians. And then I started becoming more in tune with my identity personally and academically. And I started expanding my research to Latin American muscular Christianity, because I myself was lost in my identity, and also the very brief analysis that's given by other scholars of muscular Christianity on Latin America is dangerously overgeneralized. Like it kind of dismisses it as sort of, this is how it was in the global South and global East. It wasn't about, didn't have much to do with religion. It had to do with more of just accepting a regime about hard bodies to like become a man in the world. Whereas, as we see, especially with Puerto Rican muscular Christianity, that was not the case. It was not about this lack of religion or just using it as a function. It was a practice. It was a way of envisioning a state that would be better for the Puerto Rican evangelicals and what they believe would be better for the people.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments too that anyone would like to ask? Let's see. Oh yeah, I see several people. So Raquel and then Emmanuel.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just had one question. I don't know, I kind of missed it, but if you could just like in simpler terms go over the term of modernity once more, and like how that correlates to the muscular Christians both in the US and then in Latin America as well.
Yeah, so modernity it's just basically this like it's like an envisionment of a liberal democracy that recognizes and represents all people equally, that upholds everyone's human rights. And in a what was the second part of that question? How that relates to Latin America?
Yeah, like how they relate in contrast to like US and then Latin
Oh,
America.
right, yeah. So with modernity in Latin America, it was modernity in Latin America. That's a good question. I'm trying to use like like more lay terms about it. It originally started the modernity, the conception of it in a white American muscular Christianity, but in a way that had that promoted it. It's an all-encompassing kind of umbrella term, but it was adopted in different ways. The thing about it is it's very Eurocentric because it's about universality. It's trying to emphasize being inclusive of everyone without having everyone speak on it, on what modernity is. So it's lacking representation. And with an example of that in Latin American muscular Christianity, when it was adopted, that modernity thing, an example of that you see is when they're trying not to recognize race or religion or class in that story about the Turkish Muslim man. So like nowadays, there's people that do that still too, right? They're trying like, oh, I don't see color, I don't see race, I don't see gender or anything. Like, let's treat everybody equally. That actually brings harm to people because you're just ignoring their own experiences, their own forms of oppression, and their own voices of what they would like to say. And another example of that is the article, the really anti-Black article that some Mexican muscular Christians reoccurringly publish, which is the Help for the Blacks, where they're trying to where they're supposedly saying that they're doing a post-racial world kind of thing where they don't see that, so there's no more harm in that. But then they publish things like Help for the Blacks article where they're recognizing race, right? They're saying that these Black African American YMCA members are trying to make a building for a YMCA building, and then they spend a majority of the time, the Mexican muscular Christians, talking about a white man that's going to match the funds. So it's kind of it's a contradiction between saying that you're going to see a post-racial, post-gender, post-classes world, and then with Latin American muscular Christians, you see that's not the case. They're still emphasizing race in a way, anti-Blackness, because they're completely ignoring African American efforts. And then also this started with white American muscular Christianity. Not modernity itself, the conception. It's a lot older, but just sort of that. It's that universality and ideal representation that doesn't allow for other contributions from other people, trying to speak for others.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. And Kim, that was a big question. And I was thinking, wow, how is she going to answer this? And you did a really good job. So thank you so much for starting that discussion too. I see a hand from Emmanuel.
Yeah, I got something a little more simpler, which was basically, what is the purpose of muscular masculinity in your research? Like,
muscular masculinity in my research, in terms of like why I'm interested in doing this, or like the phrase muscular Christianity itself, like I should have made that clear. I didn't actually coin that. That's an actual phrase and social movement that was used by muscular Christians.
I was talking about like the phrase.
Oh, the phrase itself of muscular Christianity?
Yes.
Okay, so like how I use it in my research, or
I guess, yeah, like how it was used in the research. Yes.
how it was used in the research. Muscular Christianity, how it was used in the research. Well, muscular Christian, like the definition. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out like the question of that's such a broad question. I don't even know how to start with that. I'm just trying to figure out the like how to start like how I use it, or like it's how it's been used in primary sources. Introduce muscular Christianity and its relationship to. Oh, this is a different question.
Yeah, I see a couple of, let's see, Emmanuel, you're welcome to chime in if you would like to clarify a little bit the question. There is also a question in the chat, which is, can you go into more detail about muscular Christianity and its relationship to the church and state?
Yeah. So muscular Christianity was so there's a general overview of how a modern Protestant church and state could go, a sort of a vision by Puerto Rican evangelicals, but not every Puerto Rican evangelical was a muscular Christian. So with muscular Christians in particular, they used Christian masculine frameworks like war rhetoric, war discourses, and other things like the businessman archetype in order to try to get to that that ideal, that vision of that state. But then again, we're going back to an issue of modernity, which is that idea of universality. And like I was putting in like lay terms, speaking for other people, right? This idea of masculinity as being like, we're going to help all the people. Did certain Puerto Rican women ask for that? You know, like where is there the amplification of their own voice? So that's sort of a very brief way to answer that.
Okay, thank you. There are other questions that people might have? I guess maybe I could jump in with a sort of a question about, you know, you're starting you still have the research ahead of you, but you've already done a lot of the research too. And I'm just wondering if I'm sorry if this sounds like a little bit of a sort of a bureaucratic question, thesis related question, but I'm wondering if you could talk about like, are there chapters that you're already envisioning in your thesis? And, you know, or is it sort of premature to talk about that right now? Or are you thinking like, oh yeah, I sort of know what the chapter breaks might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super important as a graduate student to think about not just the content of what your dissertation is going to look like, but like what the framing is going to be. So I think that's a really good question. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I'm actually thinking about I haven't thought about it so specifically in terms of chapter, but I've been thinking about breaking up my work as sort of like 3 parts, which is like that critical examination of white American muscular Christianity. A lot of research that's on it right now, really just in almost to the point of romanticization of the movement. And there's a very, very a shadow history, if you will, of like it being complicit and part of oppressive and really problematic forces. So that would be like one part. This I don't think would just be a chapter on Latin American muscular Christianity. I think it would be another one. And then depending on what I'd find in my later research on Latin American muscular Christianity in the US, I would like to make that my 3rd part. So kind of breaking it up into really big parts rather than chapters yet, because I'm not entirely sure how I would do that, but yeah.
Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, maybe you could just say a little bit, if you don't mind, like describing what it was like to go into the specific archives, because it is such an archivally rich project, and it might be nice for people to hear about like where you went and what it was like to look through these photographs and, you know, what form they came to you in.
Yeah, so I started doing this research as soon as COVID, like the stay-at-home order started, and the very small, great, the good thing about being a stay-at-home and everything, I love a lot of people not being able to travel, was a lot of things became more digitized. So I've actually visited, including like Latin American archival collections. And there's one archival collection in Puerto Rico, a institution. I'm trying to look up the name of it right now, that I went to and found a lot. All the El Puerto Rico evangelical newsletters, like hundreds and hundreds of them, that I went through. And then the other one was the Mediateca. It's like an anthropological historical institute in Mexico that has a rich just collections of photographs upon photographs, millions and millions of photographs during this time period. And I actually have hundreds of YMCA photos from Mexico City from that institute. So I've actually just done digitized collections for now that are available, and I do plan on actually going to those actual institutes that I've been drawing from in person to see what hasn't been digitized yet. But it's been a really fun and exciting experience going into those like archives, even if it is digital.
Thanks. It's a very pertinent question, right? These days, when, especially those of us who are working with historical materials, to try to figure out how to get to them. And as you're saying, Kim, thankfully, a lot of things have become digitized. I don't want to monopolize, but I could ask another little question, which is, I'm wondering if you've thought at all about sort of case studies, like have any sort of single sort of stories of people come to the fore that you might wish to, dig more into, and if so, who might a couple of these figures be, or one?
That's a really great question. And I was actually looking for major figure names of like Latin American muscular Christianity, like who is leading these movements. And really the major names that keep popping up are actually of those of white American muscular Christians. So I think that's part of my argument that I'm saying about like this idea of universality and shared like camaraderie in a modern state, was actually really just unintentional compliance to like that US imperialism, because the emphasis was placed on certain leading white American Protestant men. Like Theodore Roosevelt gets mentioned a lot in the newsletters, but it's very difficult to find prominent members of Latin American muscular Christianity. That's not to say that they're not there, but it would take a lot more searching and digging. And I'm trying to get to that point where it's a case study of Latin American muscular Christianity. It's not just about the white Americans that are in the U.S. So yeah, that's definitely that's something that's been on my mind, and how to frame that, how to go about it with my research, because I would love to do case studies. It's just a lot of them write under pseudonyms, like JRC for that The Foot of the Abyss was a pseudonym, and it's hard to find anything on them. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely relate to that kind of challenge. I'm wondering if you've looked at you talk about the newsletters, the editors of the newsletters that you're saying, some of them write under pseudonyms, but I wonder if maybe that would be one trail to follow.
It's just so difficult to find even the editor's name. It's very interesting, because I would look at the end of each newsletter and try to find any kinds of names, and it would end up being just a bunch of advertisements, like 3 pages of just advertisements and no names. So yeah, anytime I find a name on a newsletter, I really hold on to it, and I look to see if there's anything available that could lead me to something else.
Yeah, absolutely. The ephemera is so interesting and so frustrating too, right? All right, and are there any other thoughts or comments? Oh, I see a hand. Isabella.
Hello. I was wondering if you could maybe emphasize or restate the main differences between Christian masculinity in Puerto Rico and Mexico, because my call was kind of cutting in the beginning and I feel like I missed a lot of it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so major difference is so when these social movements started, muscular Christianity in the US or in Puerto Rico or in Mexico, a lot of it came from, it was part of it was like in a way reactionary. You know, they started the movement by saying and practicing what they supposedly weren't. And in Puerto Rico, the really important thing was trying to stop the Catholic Church from continuing its control over the people. So it really focused on countering that power and trying to just stop it and start something anew that was Protestant based, right, rather than Catholic based. Not a separation of church and state, but having a Protestant church and state. And in Mexican muscular Christianity, it didn't have to do so much with this is the power that we're trying to get people to see is a power that we all need to stop, but rather just the overall violence and carnage that was happening during the Mexican Revolution. Mexican muscular Christians were like, we need to move past this. Let's try to get to a post-revolutionary modern state. And so that's what I was saying a little earlier, like, one could argue that they were actually a part of siding with the oppressors because, it's like a bourgeoisie. They weren't taking a stand specifically and standing side by side with the agrarian working class revolutionaries. But this neutral stance was them trying to facilitate and get to something that was inclusive for all people. So yeah, it was more, I don't know if that answers your question, but like those were the two main differences between the movements.
It definitely does. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the question. And we do have a little bit of time. So if anyone would like to jump in with a question or a comment or any kind of message to Kim, speak now. Tiffany.
Hi, Kim. You did an absolutely fantastic job. It was such an interesting talk. And what really struck me was your integration of existing scholarship and how you kind of engage with the existing scholarship surrounding, your topic. And I was just kind of curious, coming from very little background context to what you're discussing, how your research kind of aligns with the established scholarship. In that, are you challenging any previously conceived ideas surrounding this, or are you just taking it to the next level and kind of taking the baton from previous scholars and continuing it? I'm just kind of curious about the scholarship and the historiography of what you're kind of discussing.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you, Tiffany. I don't think it's so much as challenging the definitions that I quoted from other scholars to describe muscular Christianity in the U.S. is they're different ways of framing it. It's just the scope is the U.S. and it's just going into Latin American muscular Christianity. There's not much there at all, like in terms of secondary work, secondary sources. And so it's just really starting with what can we start as scholars in this analysis. And when I was doing the critical examination of muscular Christianity in the US, it's just expanding the work of the scholars that have already written on it before. But instead of it just being about like, oh, hey, like let's focus on gender and really focus on how this was the origin of the sports culture we have today. I'm going in a different lens and being like, okay, how is this framing of gender though a power dynamic that's working with other forms of just Western globalization and like Western like oppression, because and at the same time not trying to reduce a religion to a mere function. So in my critical examination of muscular Christians in the US, I really focus on their religious experiences and things like that. But how can we get to not just appreciating muscular Christianity for what it's done for sports culture today, but like let's get critical about it without at the same time, for me, having to reduce its religion and that social movement to just the mere function. And with Latin America, it's two different conversations kind of happening at the same time, or not conversations, two audiences. With Latin America being more like there's not much there, so it's starting from the beginning, and then with muscular Christianity in the US, it's kind of expanding that and saying like, well, let's look at it this way instead of just about sports culture and gender.
Thank you. It's super interesting. So thank you.
Thanks for the question. Is there anything else anyone would like to add to the discussion? All right, well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your active participation. This is a great conversation. Thank you to Kim for this incredible research project and for sharing it with us. And maybe we should, let's see, Susan, could you perhaps give a little reminder to us about our next event for the Global 19th Century?
I am caught unprepared with that exact date, so I do apologize. But we are having a fabulous talk. It's going to be in early May, and it is going to be on the origins of entrepreneurialism in the United States. It's on Thursday, May 12th at 11 a.m. It's Martin Gerdot from Sciences Po, the French political science university. So I'll get an exact title for that talk and description shortly, but May 12th is that what I just said? May 12th is the date to remember. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then I see also a comment about the next roundtable, Uncommon Emergency, a roundtable on the invasion of Ukraine, border violence, war, and unshared suffering, which is being sponsored by the Center for Ideas in Society, Wednesday, March 9, from 12 to 1:30 on Zoom, and the registration link. Thank you so much, Dylan, for adding that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim, and everyone have a good rest of the week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan.